say it a lot of ways. You can say cardiac output. You can say pulmonary trunk and pulmonary artery blood flow. You can say pulmonary artery pressure. All these would give the same response. And this is pulmonary vascular resistance. So what does the curve look like? Yeah, I love it. It goes like this. So as more and more blood enters into pulmonary vasculature, the resistance to blood flow gets less and less and less. Few reasons for that. You're opening parallel pathways, but what you guys would understand right away is in these small capillaries, there's actually capillary and arterial, small arterial distension. Because the pulmonary side, very thin walls. So when you have a decrease, an increase in radius, remember radius is to the fourth power, you have a whopping decrease in resistance. Okay? So the driving force for gas exchange, so gas exchange across membrane, whether it's going from the alveolus to a pulmonary capillary to an alveolus, or if it's happening at the tissue, it's that same diffusion equation that we talked about. So what drives it? Partial pressure gradient. Diffusivity, does it have an impact? Absolutely. Absolutely. The surface area have an impact? Absolutely. Thickness of the barrier diffusion? Yes. But those are determinants and they aren't drivers. So, which statement is correct? The heme subunit of hemoglobin can transport carbon dioxide. What does the heme subunit transport? Oxygen. What can the globin subunit transport? CO2 in the form of what's called a carbamyl compound, but it has to be a specific form of hemoglobin. What kind? Deoxyhemoglobin. Yes, so here it is. If oxygen's still bound to the heme subunits, that globin subunit is unavailable for the CO2 to bind. But if that hemoglobin molecule releases its 4 oxygens from the 4 subunits, then that globin subunit is available for CO2 to bind. Okay? An increase in CO2 causes a left upward shift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So, here is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and those of you in the front won't be able to see, but this is PO2 on the bottom. Here on the left, it's percent oxyhemoglobin. So what this is telling me is when you're in a high oxygen environment, you have a lot more oxyhemoglobin than when you're in a very low oxygen environment, then you have much less oxyhemoglobin. So this is asking about if you have an increase in CO2. So would it cause a left upward shift, or let's just kind of draw it in here, a right downward shift? Which would it be? And I agree with Kim's in the back. I don't know if she's pointing at me, but this one right here. CO2, temperature, an increased CO2, an increased temperature, an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, which is the same thing as saying a decrease in pH. All of those will cause a right downward shift. And what does that mean? If you have a right downward shift, does that mean there's an increased affinity for oxygen by hemoglobin or a decreased affinity? Decreased affinity. It's more likely to. All of these are present during increased metabolic activity. And when you have an increased metabolic activity, you want the hemoglobin to release the oxygen here. So that one doesn't look so good. If you have 70% oxyhemoglobin, you have an equal amount of deoxyhemoglobin. How much deoxyhemoglobin would you have? 30%. 30%. You only have 100% hemoglobin. So if you have 70% oxyhemoglobin, that means you would have 30% deoxyhemoglobin. So the majority of carbon dioxide transported in the plasma is in the form of bicarbonate. Yes, no, maybe?
Yes.
A lot of heads going up and down. Yes, 70 to 80% of carbon dioxide, those carbons are actually being transported in the bloodstream in the form of bicarbonate. Think that carbonic anhydrase equation. CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid, which dissociates into a proton and a bicarbonate molecule. Moving from a partial pressure of oxygen of 100 torr here to 80 torr, that'd be something like there, would cause most of the oxyhemoglobin to release its oxygen. Not even close, because when you're at 100 torr gas, you're about 97, 98% saturated. Can somebody make my day? What is the partial pressure of oxygen coming into pulmonary capillaries? Just coming up through the venous blood into pulmonary capillaries. 40, yeah. And guess what? At 40, it's still 75% saturated. So I don't want you to memorize a whole bunch of numbers about this, but if you think when you have 100 torr of oxygen, you're about 97% saturated with oxygen. Even with low partial pressure of oxygen of 40 torr, you still have 75% oxyhemoglobin, only 20% deoxyhemoglobin. You have to get to these really low pressures to lose most of your oxyhemoglobin. So, hopefully everybody does fine. Oh, by the way, nice to see you back after Thanksgiving. Hope you had a good one. So, we jump into renal physiology. Renal physiology, what we're going to talk about first is organization of the renal system and basic renal processes. There's 4 basic renal processes. Then we'll turn our attention to regulation of sodium and water balance. And there's an old saying, so goes sodium, so goes the kidney. So goes sodium, so goes the kidney, because so many different functions of the kidney are chained to sodium. And then there's some independent study, Amelia, can I borrow this? This handout right here. This is what's called a program learning packet. It says A0 up on top. I want you to hold off to wait to do this until Thursday after class, okay? And the way you will, because you'll be set up to understand it, the way this works is you'll read this panel, this top panel right here, A0. And oh, there's some questions right down here. You will then simply turn the page. The back side of that page, you see A1. Ah, and right here are the answers. Here's a new set of information and facts. Another set of questions. You'll then turn the page. There's A3. So you go A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, like that. So you do the top panels first, and then you go back and you do the bottom panels. What you're going to learn here is the concept of clearance, renal clearance. There's a number of molecules that are cleared from the bloodstream by the kidneys. And you're going to learn basic glucose handling, which quite important. And we already talked about how the respiratory system regulates CO2. We're going to see the renal system regulates bicarbonate. And it's the CO2 to bicarb balance that primarily regulates pH in your extracellular fluid. You need 20 bicarbs for every CO2 to have a pH of 7.4. And you have 2, that's a very weak, it's a very weak buffer system, but it works very well for us. Why? Because we have two different organ systems working on the same thing. Lungs, we're going to handle CO2. Kidneys, we're going to handle bicarb. We're going to work together. Okay? And they working together help affect acid-base homeostasis. So let's start thinking about the renal system and basic renal processes, functions of the kidney. You know, anybody asks, what do the kidneys do? Well, they make urine. Well, yes, they do. But they do so many more things for us. They regulate sodium and water balance. That's so important, and I already talked about this when we were in CV physiology. Yeah, in cardiovascular physiology, you think about baroreceptors and regulating blood pressure responses. And baroreceptors are very, very good at recognizing a change in blood pressure and changing autonomic nervous system output to either increase or decrease blood pressure as needed. But any mid and long-term blood pressure regulation requires the kidney because it requires sodium and water balance alterations. So kidneys, central to blood pressure control. The kidneys regulate so many. You can put more than a couple dozen of inorganic ions, potassium, calcium, phosphate, and it's not just ions, it's things like urea, but so many different things. Your kidneys will excrete metabolic waste, such as too much urea, too much creatinine. Creatinine is it's a metabolic waste product from contracting muscles that as muscle proteins turn over, you'll release some of that. It's good for excretion of foreign and excess substances. We encounter a lot of foreign substances throughout the days, and we have different elimination systems in the body. And one of the most important is our kidneys. Our kidneys will recognize certain things that are foreign and release them through the urine. Now, things we have in excess, our body can release those too. We have, for example, too much bicarbonate. We can get rid of it. We can get rid of it by renal excretion. Regulation of acid base, already mentioned. The lungs regulate CO2. The kidneys regulate bicarb. But the kidneys do more and more things for us. Now, we already talked about renin, the renin angiotensin aldosterone system for regulating blood pressure. Well, renin is released from the kidney to help set off that cascade, converting angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then passes pulmonary capillaries where it encounters ACE enzymes, which convert it to angiotensin 2, which then binds receptors and causes release of aldosterone. And those last two steps help regulate blood pressure. Your kidneys are very important for the final activation of vitamin D. Sunlight will convert a certain form of cholesterol to a molecule which will go to the kidney, and it'll be hydroxylated in one place. And, excuse me, I think I said it wrong. So sunlight converts this one form of cholesterol which goes into circulation. It goes to the liver, and the liver hydroxylates it in the 25 position, so you get 25 cholecalciferol, a very, very weak form of vitamin D. But then that 25 cholecalciferol goes through the kidney, and you have what's called a 1-alpha hydroxylase enzyme in the kidney, and it causes that vitamin D to be converted to 1,25 dihydroxy cholecalciferol. That's active vitamin D. Very important for calcium balance. So kidney's important for calcium balance. If you would go to altitude and stay at altitude, you know, and I don't mean you need to go too far to altitude. Even if you go to Denver, you go to Laramie, and you stay there for a week or so, well, your body is going to recognize, well, there's a lower partial pressure of oxygen here in the atmosphere, there's going to be a lower partial pressure of oxygen in your arterialized blood. If your kidney, do write this down, because I won't really mention it again. If the kidney is perfused by low partial pressure oxygen blood, that stimulates the release of erythropoietin. This is a hormone that goes throughout the body, and what does it do? It stimulates red blood cell production. So if you go to higher and higher altitudes where there's less and less oxygen, guess what? Over days and weeks, your body's response is to release erythropoietin from the kidneys to build red blood cells. And red blood cells grab onto and transport oxygen throughout the body. So, you as a clinician, when you have a patient tending toward renal failure, are you going to start getting pretty excited? Yeah. Your kidneys do a lot of things for you. A lot of things for you. They don't just make some urine so you get rid of a little excess water. Yeah, they do that. But look at all the other stuff they do. Now, this is partially a review of things we've seen before with a couple of new things thrown in. Let's say your resting cardiac output as you sit here for a 70 kilogram person. Let's go 70 kilogram person. That person's cardiac output, what's being pumped out of that left ventricle every minute? 5 to 6 liters of blood every minute. Well, guess what? Fully 20% of that cardiac output is going to be going to the kidneys for renal blood flow. So your kidneys, imagine, they're only the size of your fists. So you have your two kidneys about the size of your fist. They're getting 20% of your cardiac output every single minute. Why do they take that much energy? No. They're doing all these other jobs for us. So renal blood flow is a very large percentage, 20% of cardiac output, because those kidneys are being perfused with that blood and all this is going on. Eliminating bad guys.